All right, everyone. I think we're ready to get started again. So welcome back. So our next speaker is Jesse from Twilio. And actually, I have a good friend who works at Twilio, and I reached out to him and asked him, "Hey, are you doing Backstage?" And he said, "Yes, we are. You need to talk with Jesse." And we've been working with Autodesk has been working with Jesse's team in this Canoe project that we're going to talk about a little bit later as well. And I've been really impressed with what you're building and how you're building it. You have a really great team, Jesse. So look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for the invite. Hey, everybody. Good morning over there on the West Coast. Yeah, so like Brandon said, work at Twilio Segment, the leading customer data platform. So we're a part of Twilio, the broader company. Quickly about me, and then we'll get into the talk as well. So yeah, my name is Jesse Adametz, Director of Engineering for Developer Platform at Twilio Segment. Really similar to, I think, maybe a lot of the speakers today, or like Levi's description of his team earlier. You know, we focus on CI, CD, the experience of Terraform as infrastructure as code with Terraform. And then we also have an enablement team specifically focused on things like Backstage, the developer journey tooling that we've had over time, and now as we move those legacy tools like like CLIs and things like that to tools like Backstage. We've got teams focusing on that. Personally, my wife, 2 sons, dog, and cat. We live in Florida. It is as hot and more humid than everybody says, but I miss California every day. So I'm jealous. Couldn't be there today. I'm an SRE at heart. I think a lot of what I focus on in the broader infrastructure landscape, I try to present that with Developer Platform, but bringing that ease of reliability to our platform as a whole. And I like to think that Developer Platform and things like Backstage as an IDP can kind of be that front door to infrastructure more broadly. Prior to that, as a data engineer in another life, but again, a lot of inspiration there of like how I look at infrastructure and maybe more importantly, how I don't want everybody else to look at infrastructure. And I think that's where platforms like these can come into place. Really passionate about DevOps as a culture, not a title. That might be a hot take. Happy to talk about that anytime. But really DevOps is how we work, how we accomplish the delivery of high quality software. And again, I think developer platforms and the things that we can build into our IDPs are a core part of that. So a little bit about this talk. Call this an agenda slide. Going to set obviously a little bit of business context. And really want to talk about how we got started with Backstage. I think we're going to hear a lot about that today in general, that there's different starting points, there's different journeys in general about where people's platforms are, or what's most important to prioritize for different companies. And I want to leave the space like that's okay, right? Like we're all going to kind of start in a different place. So I want to share ours and kind of how we got that start. I'll of course have a peek inside our catalog with sidebar screenshots. I know that's one of the things I'm looking forward to most today. So going to provide that. Talk a little bit about the present and future catalog measurement. And I think my key here is I promise to try to provide time to value by slide 8. So we've only got 5 more to go. So here we go. Quickly about Segment. Segment collects events from your web and mobile apps and provides a complete data toolkit for every team in your company. So there's this kind of classic example on the left of the slide here, integrating with multiple tools that your engineers have to send data to, Google Analytics, Facebook, et cetera. And when Segment got its start, there was a single analytics.js. You send it to a tracking API, and Segment kind of handles the rest with destinations, right? So that's a bit about the core business. More tactically, we at today's scale, we handle about 400,000 requests per second, and it ends up being over 1 trillion events a month. Again, from that reliability perspective, I mentioned we strive for well over 4 nines of uptime on our different public SLAs, and again, we're part of other people's applications, so things like response time has to be very quick and very reliable. On the destination side of things, again, we help companies get their data to where they need it after they send it to us. So we do 6 trillion warehouse rows synced per month. That's just an example of kind of the scale of the platform here. this kind of starts leading into where Backstage fills a role for us. So we've got this kind of a little old now, but popular blog post at the time of goodbye microservices. We kind of rode this arc of having not a lot and then too many, and then tried to reduce that down. Despite being one of those companies, jokingly, we still have hundreds of services. That actually ends up being thousands of repositories, and these are owned by over 300 engineers that we support from a platform perspective. And these services are subsequently deployed a couple hundred times a day. So you can imagine there's a lot to figure out in terms of what exists in the catalog, who owns it, different categorizations of security tiers and priorities and things like that. And that's really the starting point for this journey. So this is my obligatory definition slide. So it gets us into taxonomy. And that was honestly the first question we asked, was just like, what, we need to define this. What do we mean, right? And unfortunately, the dictionary does an okay job. I think we center it to, hey, we want to classify things. And again, like I mentioned some of those, so we'll get into it, but really just how can we bucket things from different perspectives? And here's the time to value I promised. This was our first lesson. It is not that simple. Despite how simple you can make the definition, what we learned as we started to talk to different people across the business is everybody has a different definition of this. And we were actually a bit pedantic in this initial research, that we actually talked to all these groups, which I think was an interesting, again, learning lesson for us, that I think even in prior iterations of this with other IDP platforms, we started those iterations with just what's important to us, what's important to engineering, what are the things we need to know. And there's a lot of assumed context when you start from engineering. But we really wanted to see if we can get to a place, we saw these taxonomy questions, so to speak, coming up in other conversations related to engineering. So compliance, security, even with finance, right? Who owns this thing? And the thing they were asking about wasn't the service that engineers are talking about, right? So we set out and did that really, like I said, maybe pedantic, in depth with each group. We've probably almost 100 hours of Zoom calls kind of thing. And everyone has a different mental model, and more importantly, a different expectation if they're a stakeholder, for what it means to solve their version of taxonomy. So we're going to talk a little bit about kind of the different areas of taxonomy that we learned about, and kind of how we've gone about that. So for us, we tried to break it down into 3 pillars of taxonomy. And this was important, again, because it helped us kind of set a starting point and where to prioritize. Again, I think the one in the middle is maybe where most people are familiar, and where they start is generally just with services and infrastructure, right? Backstage's catalog is good at this out of the box. The other area was product, right? So you can maybe make the jump that many services can make up a product, or even just one, but and then organization. This I think is less talked about in my experience, but this is where a lot of the questions from other organizations outside of engineering were coming from. Again, like what team or group owns this thing, et cetera. And product is that kind of map in the middle to services and infrastructure. So maybe just to define these a bit more, again, service, we looked at this as this is the ownership of internal or external. I think that's important too, is defining what is the content of your catalog. Is it just things that make money? Is it things that are part of your platform, your infrastructure platform, or internal productivity tools, et cetera? So what are the internal, external services that enable product? Which team, you can answer questions with that, like which team is on call, who's responsible for migrating this service, upgrading its dependencies, et cetera. And then closely related is the infrastructure. And admittedly, I think we'll get into this. If not, happy to answer questions at the end. But infrastructure is, again, closely related, but not as obvious to put into the catalog. We have aspirations to put things like databases, load balancers, security groups, anything related to a service. We actually want those to be components in our software catalog as well. So again, these are closely related cloud resources in our case to the things that are necessary to operate a service. This can answer questions like where should cost be attributed? Who should security contact for an S3 bucket? Things like that. On the product taxonomy side, to give that a definition, this is the ownership of, again, billable or non-billable products and which resources and services they comprise of. Some of the questions we were being asked as we did the initial research is which team is responsible for this product? And again, like we weren't always thinking about product ownership because that's maybe a product manager and the building of those features are multiple dev teams, et cetera. So this is where that product grouping kind of comes to play. As an internal example, who can tell me more about Twilio's CI platform and how it operates, right? So if we look at our CI platform as a product that we deliver internally, it can have kind of the same information about it as like true customer-facing products. And then lastly, again, organizational taxonomy. So who are the humans that operate these services and build these products, and how are they organized? This one was interesting because as we started talking about it, everybody very quickly jumps to the HR system of record. The issue we found there, and your mileage may vary, of course, is the team names in an HR system don't always match the team names that you would refer to a team by every day, right? In my case, the teams that I lead, they fall under some like slightly outdated team name / Jesse Adametz. And it's like, well, that's not what we refer to our teams as. So instead, like, can we give it an alias kind of thing? And so we found, again, Backstage has the idea of groups and things like that. And so we've developed some systems to kind of do a one-way sync and an annotation on top of to kind of rename groups and make ownership of those groups editable, things like that. And that enables us to do some of these other questions that were asked, like who's the VP of engineering for a product? And there's nuance in that question, right? Again, product is more about, hey, what product managers can I go to? But this question is, who's their partner? Who's the VP of engineering that is responsible for delivering value for that product? Which product manager can help assess customer impact during an incident, right? Again, a non-obvious hop that we wanted to enable. Usually incidents are very much like, hey, who's the on-call engineer? Who's the incident owner? How can I find out the impact? But a product manager might have a different perspective on, maybe they're more familiar with the SLAs that are or not being broken, et cetera. So another key aspect that we wanted to deliver on. So kind of our first hypothesis that we put out there is, well, as we were getting started, as we wanted to build up the metadata, so I saw there were questions on this in Slido earlier. How do we make sure metadata A gets in there and B is high quality and stays that way? And so we had this hypothesis that if we validate input at the earliest place, so catalog info, the catalog will always have high quality data. And so what we started with was basically trying to shift that as far left as possible. And for those unfamiliar, the DevOps terminology of moving left is like in the developer process, right? How they make a change to get catalog info and how can they be told as soon as possible, hey, you have an issue, rather than trying to deploy it and then having to debug it. Hey, why didn't this information show up in the catalog? We want to tell people whether it's right or wrong immediately. So we wrote some GitHub checks with a taxonomy validator. And this is just a quick example. So one of our annotations is a security tier. And in this example, the person set it to 6 and the validator immediately failed. And so they got that quick feedback loop with a little bit more detail. If you go over to the checks tab, this was an area we spent a fair bit of time as we developed this as well. We wanted people to get all the information they needed to understand kind of a learn as they build. Hey, I got security tier wrong, but what are the right options? And kind of like put the documentation again as far left as possible right here. So in this case, again, the person put in 6 are valid tiers, as you can see here, that it must match the pattern 0, 1, or 2. So this was great. I think the outcome to that hypothesis is we learned that taxonomy validation is useful. We're glad we have it. It definitely, like I said, shifts left, gives people fast feedback loops. They're able to iterate quickly. However, it wasn't the important thing. I think we overestimated the hypothesis that like, oh, we'll just make sure the data is really good and it'll prompt people to give data early and often kind of thing. So bit of a miss, but good learning lesson. I think particularly useful out of this whole thing was coinciding with it, we adopted ADRs for what is going to be in our metadata? What's the kind of spec for Twilio Segments catalog? And as well as Twilio is a big company, we have actually a few instances of Backstage. The ADRs gave us this ability to kind of share a base spec, have the conversation of where our specs deviated from the different business units, things like that, or how to keep them in, as similar as possible, but maybe have different values or different fields that are required, et cetera. And we give that feedback loop back to the validator and make sure that different catalog infos from different parts of the business are getting validated appropriately. But all of this kind of soon led to lesson number 2 for us. And this one may be controversial, but not all catalog entities come from Git for us. We took a bit of I call it a shotgun approach, so to speak, where we kind of saw this unbounded possibility with the catalog of what it could have in it. I kind of alluded earlier that we wanted things like databases or load balancers, things like that in the catalog. And we quickly were like, well, we're going to have catalog info for those, or is there something like dynamic entities? And we took the shotgun approach where we tested out a few early on, and I think we proved it out well. So dynamic entities for us, like sourcing those entities, has provided massive leverage. The existence of these dynamic entities are always up to date. It populates infrastructure components with no additional work for service owners. And just as an example, it makes Backstage the center of some of our ops processes, which on the arc of adoption was one of our ways to get other teams more usage, things like that, of, hey, Backstage is in the critical path for accomplishing work. So I give this example of like, we classify our repositories differently for different reasons. And we now use Backstage as the way to do that because we have GitHub repos as entities, not just the services within the repos. And so on the right of our catalog, you can see things like AWS accounts, Terraform workspaces, et cetera. And I'll take a sec to kind of show what those look like as native entities. Of course, sorry for all the blurring, but this is an example of what the catalog page looks like filtered down to type cloud account. And you can see, what you would maybe expect to see, the different names. We've got things like account ID. We do a multi-account strategy in AWS. So account ID is pretty top of mind when we look at one of our AWS accounts. And then some metadata about it. Is it production? Is it stage? What team is responsible for maybe some of the security rules, et cetera. And then over time, we chose OpEx as a starting point, but we know that we'll want to tag these more. So we have tags on each of these. So a very native experience to if you're familiar with the software catalog, there's just this other type, which is cloud account. Similarly, when you click in to look at one of the accounts, you've got some relevant information, right? What's its account ID again? What's its ARN? Access level, again, what team, et cetera. And then we plan on using things, we'll get into sound check a little bit more briefly later, but sound check for enforcing rules and checks and quality on our different entity types. You've got that native experience now that something like an AWS account has its own kind of detail page within Backstage. So we found this really good. Terraform workspaces is another one. So again, I mentioned our team's focus on maybe like the UX of using Terraform at Segment. So everything we do is in infrastructure as code. And one thing our team built previously was something to keep Terraform workspaces within a window of support, right? So something that's important to us is the Terraform version. So if we get all of the workspaces in the catalog, we can quickly filter by version. We can run sound checks on it and things like that. So just another example, again, you have a Terraform workspace, you see its detail page and everything related to it. The relations graph gets really interesting. Obviously, there's a lot of opportunity there to make that increasingly interesting in the future. But again, yeah, who owns what, who to contact when you have a question about something, et cetera. So I mentioned we have GitHub repositories, and I saw some similar metadata of services on Levi's slides earlier, right? You want to know things like, I don't know, in Levi's case, is it part of an online event? In our case, it's, we've got parts of the business that deal with Black Friday and Cyber Monday. And this is ways where when we do our repo classification, we can have some of this stuff right here. So Cool. I'm going to speed up a little bit. So what about cataloginfo.yaml, right? I mentioned earlier with dynamic stuff, that's not exactly the case. And what we learned is Git is not the right UX for everyone and everything. The classic example we ran into was changing ownership. If a team name is wrong, or if a service moved to a different team, et cetera, it was rather clunky. We heard feedback-wise that people didn't want to always go to Git. And so we, using actually the software template engine in Backstage, we have this manage entity tab on our page, and you can use this version of the template to simply change the ownership on an entity. So that was cool. Second hypothesis, transparently reporting catalog completeness will make it a group effort. So I think this is kind of unique to us. We built catalog health as part of our catalog. And so you can see it here in the nav, and this is a little bit of what the page looks like. So again, just providing the visibility, what's in the catalog, how much of it is in a state that we want. Obviously, we want to get to 100% ownership. We also started looking at like a different dynamic. So are all things created equal? Do we want to get to 100% ownership, or do we want to get to 100% ownership of things that are actively deployed? So they're more used services, maybe more important, quote unquote. So this gives us that ability as well. Here's just a couple other gauges to give you a sense of what we're measuring. So I mentioned AWS accounts earlier. I mentioned Terraform workspaces. And this is actually that perspective I was just mentioning, right? So 20% of our Terraform workspaces currently have a valid owner, but 96% of the recently deployed workspaces have an owner, or are represented in the catalog. And so that gives you, again, that different perspective of the data. On the metadata front, and more on the groups, we're tackling things like mapping to Jira projects, Slack channels on how to contact teams. Do they have a valid PagerDuty set up? Things like that. And so, yeah, that's more, a little bit of shotgun approach, like I mentioned earlier, but different ways that we're trying to put our IDP like in the critical path and just enhance the metadata of the catalog. So outcome number 2, making the data visible is critical. Like we mentioned, each area of the catalog is showing consistent adoption and greater completeness. Some of those metrics I just showed have moved as much as 20% in the last quarter, because we've kind of used that page as the driving force for doing better. And then I think last point here, going forward, I mentioned Soundcheck earlier. So on the front of service readiness and enforcement with Spotify Soundcheck, this is one of their paid plugins, not necessarily sponsored or anything here, but just posting or mentioning that this is a good offering. This is going to be our essentially service readiness framework. And so this is just an example of like our Terraform workspaces with a couple of checks that we've built so far. Again, simple checks of, does it have an owner? Is it on the right version? Things like that. And this is going to give us more of this holistic view and let Backstage kind of run these they call them tracks of like improvement or increasing quality of the services within our catalog. So quick review, and then happy to get to Q&A. Teams usually adopt Backstage for the software catalog, in my opinion. I think you should be clear about your goals and what you mean by taxonomy. That'll help a long way in conversations. Identify a starting point for populating your catalog. There are a lot of data sources. We've only covered like 6 or 7 today. And your customers can help you roadmap and prioritize, I think, if you've got an idea of what those are and how to talk about them. Track completeness and quality. It builds trust. Hopefully we all are familiar with that. And then your catalog should suit your team's needs. There's no right answer. So that's kind of where I started this talk. I think different teams will implement Backstage in different ways. I think that is good. And let's have more conversations like this to share our journeys. And with that, that's everything I wanted to tell you about. Happy to answer Q&A.
Awesome. Thank you, Jesse.
Yeah.
So we have time for about 1 or 2 questions. So I'm going to try to gather some of these together. But you talked a lot about taxonomy. And the systems model itself. And at Autodesk, we're in this situation too, where we're starting to realize that the resolution of our systems model, our taxonomy, doesn't give us the resolution we need or the specificity we need to achieve some of our trust and compliance outcomes. And it impacts our productivity. It has a wide impact. I'm interested in what your model was before, and then once you redefine the new taxonomy, how did you go about reclassifying all of your stuff into that taxonomy? What was that effort like?
Yeah, I'd say it's a little bit of a mixed bag. I think historically before the IDP, we had good processes in place. I mentioned things like security tier, for example. And I think what we're seeing is that those are efforts that were much more manual in the past, and Backstage is making them either automated or centralizing the way, making the way that people do this classification look like all of the ways that we would do classification. We've done a couple of projects that, like I mentioned, put Backstage in the critical path, so to speak. I think another example of this is we have a security like ticketing process for things like vulnerabilities or secrets or whatever. And in Jira, somebody asked this question similar too, is like we integrate with Jira where when you get one of those tickets, there's a bit of triage that obviously has to happen of like, what team does this ticket belong to? Yep. And Backstage is syncing those teams to Jira so that those teams are always up to date. And subsequently updating a handful of other fields of like, hey, who's the DRI? Who's the manager of that team? So they're the risk owner of this thing. So I don't know if that directly answers the question, but is to say like Backstage is helping transform existing processes, I think, more, and just aiding in the critical path of things.
So coalescing a couple of the questions together again, and to follow up on that a little bit, the taxonomy of the systems model that you're using now, how close is it to the one that ships with Backstage? If you had to modify it, did that impact like your ability to stay close to the open source project and utilize plugins, et cetera?
Yeah, great question. I think the core taxonomy is still really close. We haven't introduced many, if any, like custom components or anything like that. What we have developed, though, I talked a little bit, obviously, about the dynamic entities. And so we call these mutations. And I think I actually saw a blog from Rody recently that they did something really similar. So that was great validation. But we have these things called mutations where even if data starts with the catalog info, we're able to mutate it, something like the entity ownership change. And those are things that live in the system. They kind of re-permutate on top. So again, like didn't have to change the actual spec of the entity, but this is kind of glue on top that kind of reprocesses after the fact.
Awesome. I'm kind of interested. I know you're early in your sound check implementation, but overlaying that trust and compliance data, security or compliance data on top of the systems model seems like a really winning combination. Provides the resolution to be able to map the outcome that you're trying to reach to the actual thing that needs to provide that outcome. Have you written custom checks for sound check? Like how are you actually mapping the data from, this resource has this configuration to the check itself? So have you started to get into the realm of writing custom checks?
Yeah, in full transparency, we haven't. I think we've got a good understanding of the fact that there are these kind of two camps, so to speak. There's the data in the catalog already is going to be, I think, a big bucket, right? Things like just running checks on the security tier or whatever, it's already in the catalog. So those are very easy, even through like a click and drag and drop UI that SoundCheck gives. We know there's that other camp, and we haven't explored that yet of, what data are we going to need to send dynamically because some other system is doing the evaluation. I think in the middle is actually, and I don't personally know how many of these exist, but there's these SoundCheck modules. And so an easy one to understand is GitHub. Yep. And so while it's not in the catalog, there's a GitHub module that would then give us a bunch of facts about where that thing came from and the repo and things about that. So you could extend that to maybe we have a check on, is branch protection enabled, or was a pull request not reviewed, or things like that. So still early in the journey, like you mentioned, but I think a lot does come without the need for the glue, hopefully.
Awesome. So that's all the time we have for questions. Thank you very much, Jesse. I appreciate your time.
Absolutely. Thanks for the invite. And everybody enjoy the rest of the talks.
All right, so now we're going to do lunch. I've been told that we have a lot of food. So if you're at Autodesk, don't go to the 5th floor. Help us eat the food we have here. And we will be back at 12:30. Thank you.